Welcome to Tales from the Art Side. Today, by popular demand,
Come on, do it. Lay it on right here, do it.
well, at least 4 of you asked for it, I'll be building Bioshock 2's big sister.
Oh no! Run, Daddy! It's Big Sister!
I'm excited to show you how I put this build together, so, let's get started. I began by sorting through all my junk piles, looking for parts and pieces that might be usable for this build. Often the parts I find will help drive the look, scale, and sometimes even the process. This is important. It's a time for my mind to work out an overall game plan, even though the plan often changes as the work progresses. Once I had my potential parts gathered, it was time to lay out the armature. I build the armature using aluminum armature wire. I'm using a rough template that has been scaled based on some of the key parts that I've gathered. This figure will end up being 16 inches tall, with an additional 2 inches added once the base is put on. That's my favorite part. Even though it's just foam, in my mind, it's like this. You know what I'm talking about, right? As a safety note, whenever doing a process that requires a protective respirator, I will pop this icon in the corner of the screen. That way I don't have to break up the video every time I use it, but still let you know the times that it is needed. Once the armature was completed and posed, it was time to start the sculpting. For the hands, instead of using clay, I made the palms from epoxy putty. It will harden before I bake the clay. This will allow me to pose the armature wire in the putty and work the clay without distorting the palms of the hands, sort of like when I used ball bearings for the eyes of the handyman head sculpt. It was a total experiment and seemed to work well. Once the hands were set, it was time to use the sculpey clay to build up the forms of the body. I'm not worried about making a perfect finished sculpture, since 90% of this will ultimately be covered up, just properly building up the underlying forms. Once the epoxy putty had hardened with the fine armature wire embedded in, sculpting the clay over the top was much easier than if the whole hand was made from soft clay. I sculpted the body just a bit skinny, keeping in mind that cloth and leather and other gear will go over the top. She's supposed to be skinny, but not that skinny. After baking the clay, I needed to run the wires to the head and the right hand. To hide the wire, I ran them between the, remember kids, crack kills. Oh boy, even I have to shake my head to the cringe of that dad joke. Well, after the wire was run, I do a little light test, and we are good to go. For the canvas undersuit that the big sister wears, I'm using a material from an old blouse. Finding a material that is right can sometimes be difficult. It's like Studson explained in his Ganondorf video. When using cloth for miniatures, the scale can often just seem off. I find it can often be too thick or stiff, or the weave is too large. So finding a properly scaled material is very important. Now it's time for all her leather wraps. I will be using leather scraps left over from a pair of buckskin pants I made over, 20 years ago. I needed the pants as part of a costume for a series of oil paintings I was working on. After cutting all my pieces, I went through and colored them with a dark brown oil-based leather stain. The buckskin was great to work with for this project. Notice its elasticity. This gave me the ability to stretch and fit each piece tightly into place. Once I got the wraps glued on, I used some fine leather lacing to hide any seams or unsightly gaps. Here, I am painting in some faux metal plates that are formed to the legs. I tried other alternatives, but this actually gave me the best result. Plus, most of it will be covered by buckles, straps, leg braces. Ultimately, it turned out really nicely. Now it's time for me to make all the leather straps and add the buckles. This girl loves her buckles and straps. Altogether, I will attach 36 of these buggers. Sadly, I didn't make or repurpose the buckles from somewhere else. I actually had to break down and buy some doll buckles. Sorry to let you down. There are just too many, and it would have taken forever to make them by hand. For a decorative edging, I used a thin armature wire wrapped tightly around the leather here and there. Like I said, lots of straps, but they are such a cool design element. They're a key part of this character. I just love it. For added detail, I cut down some brass nails to act as rivets for her vest or corset. And of course, all the little strap holes. Can't forget that detail. Time to stop and do a progress check. At this point, I'm really happy with the leather work. In preparation for the leg braces, I've gathered a bunch of rivet-on button parts. These are buttons that you just rivet onto a piece of material. They're left over from past projects, and I think they'll be great for acting as offsets for the leg braces. For the knee joint, I'm using some larger brass button parts. It's funny how often I find certain bits will be repeatedly used for a project. For this one, it's a lot of button parts. For example, the Big Daddy, there's a lot of googly eyes along with bullet primers and casings.
I like him.
Yeah, like little sisters, they're big fans of Tales from the Art Side now. Now that, once I built the Big Daddy, big fans. I ended up using a heavy metal foil glued to the forearms. This area would be more prominent than the calves, so I ended up using the foil over paint for these underplates. For the bottom of the boots, I cut up some scraps of tooling leather. These could have been made with just about anything around 1/8 of an inch thick. After getting the soles of the boots made, it was time to build up the rest of the boot. Once again, I was back to the buckskin leather. I was able to shape it into position, and it'll paint up nicely as well. To fill in the gaps, I use my go-to industrial painter's caulk. Nothing fancy, the same stuff you might use when painting your house. Once I was happy with the boots, it was time to prime and paint. Now that I had the main form of the boot built and painted, I was able to add a bunch of details over the top of it. The leather ankle guards, the brass buttons for the metal ankle joints, and the little knobby toe nubbin thing. Little nubbins. That must be their rapper name. And anyway, and all the leather boot and ankle straps. Can't forget those. For the leg braces, I decided to use leftover electrical connectors from the Handyman build, attached to plastic straps from zip ties. I found the zip ties worked really well for these leg braces. They had a rib pattern that painted up nicely, plus they were flexible enough to conform to her legs and yet still look strong and durable. Once I had the leg braces pinned and glued into place, I capped them off with brass buttons at their joint locations. I ended up cutting the leg shields from an old medicine bottle. The plastic was of the right thickness, plus it had a nice curve to wrap slightly around the legs. I detailed these leg braces with some leather lacing and tiny brass tacks for rivets, trying to match the look I was seeing in the game and concept art. Once built, it was time to get them painted up and glued into place. Much like the Big Daddy, the Big Sister needs weights to keep her down while in the water, though she only has one around her waist, while the Big Daddy has two around his waist as well as one around each ankle. She needs to be fast and agile, I guess. To build her weight, I'm going to use a very similar technique as I did with the Big Daddy, shaping a piece of EXP foam, painting it to look like old lead, putting a leather wrap around it, and strapping it around her waist. For the weapons, I pulled out all the giblets I had set aside previously. For these glass tubes on her arms, I used old car fuses. I found that by soaking these fuses for a few minutes in acetone, it made releasing the metal end caps from the glass much easier. That was after crushing one to tiny little sharp bits. For the larger tube, that looks something like a baby bottle, I cut down an old pin and capped it with the brass from a spent .40 caliber pistol round. You may ask, why not a 9mm? It's like, why does the Little Mermaid wear seashells? Because B shells are too small and D shells are just too big. Well, that's some cowboy logic right there. Anyway, I mixed up and colored some 5-minute epoxy and filled the tubes and strapped them into place so that the epoxy would level properly to the angle that would ultimately sit on her arms. For what I interpreted as spring-loaded syringes, I glued some old bicycle inner tube stem valves to my glass tubes. When I found these while digging through my junk, I was stoked. They look so cool with all the little tiny details. These are the prize giblets. For the large tube, I actually found a tiny toy baby bottle nipple in some of my junk. The weapons themselves were made, frankly, from whatever I could find that I thought would work. Many of the parts came from a broken mechanical pencil and an empty ink pen. I found that by rearranging and recombining the pen and the mechanical pencil pieces and combining them with other random giblets, I was able to recreate her nasty spear gun and large needle melee weapon. Really, this was just sort of a trial and error process, testing how the various parts fit together in a way that somewhat matched the reference as well as structurally working together well. Once I was happy with the weapons, I primed them black and did the finish paint. For these weapons, I first painted them with a dark bronze metallic paint, then added the lighter silvery paint. This process will give a good used distressed look. As a finishing touch, I found some old brass nuts that fit nicely on the ends of both of the weapons. Not sure where these came from, but they're in my bits drawer. Once these were completed, it was time to glue and strap on all these parts that I'd been busy assembling. After they were in place, I began to add all the little accessories that would go with the weapons themselves. Here I'm building some sort of clip or hook that sits over her spear weapon. This was made from some random brass parts that I had, along with a clasp hook from a broken necklace, and of course, more straps. Here I'm taking the brass electrical plates out of a broken surge protector and cutting them up to use as mounting brackets. This will later be used as the bracket that will hold the large metal shield in place that goes over the right arm. The gauges are assembled from disposable lens containers, punched out paper pieces, and like snap buttons. Like I said before, lots of buttons for this build. For the arm shield, I plan to use the side from a broken pocket knife I found laying out in a parking lot. Anyway, I built this shield by first cutting out a metal backing plate from the scrap metal that I used to build the helmet in the Pyramid Head video. I found some tiny metal knobs from my metal bits collection and glued them into place, and then painted the shield with a nice brass effect. Even though the pocket knife side didn't look exactly like the real game model, what was in the real game model, I actually liked the vented look, and it fit around the gauges very well. After the shield was in place, I continued to add various giblets and bits to the arm weapons. These pieces will add visual interest, detail, and an overall more completed look. Here, another moment to step back and do a progress check. I'd like to take this moment to thank all of you out there that watch these videos. I want to especially thank my Patreon patrons, Stephen Kick, The Shillings, Charles FDX, and my mom. Oh, wait, my mom's not a patron. Well, that's awkward. And reading this list off took a lot less time than I'd hoped. Really, thank you. Thank you all that watch, and please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things go a long way towards the YouTube algorithm. And heck, if you want to, just put a star emoji in the comments to let me know you made it this far. Thank you. Now it's time to work on the chest plate that acts as a base for the helmet. For this I decided to make the piece from a scrap of tooling leather. This leather not only was of the right thickness, but will allow me to carve in some of the additional details that I want on the chest plate, as well as shape it to fit well on her shoulders. After getting the piece cut out, I rounded the edges of the leather and then cut in a 1/4 inch offset. I punched a hole for the electrical wiring to travel through and then soaked it in water in preparation for burnishing the edges and tooling. Using gathered reference images as my guide, I roughed in a design pattern with a pencil and began the tooling, beveling, embossing, and the scarring of the leather, keeping in mind the look I wanted to achieve once it was painted. I do a quick test fitting and shaping, and next on to the collar parts. For the base of the collar, I used an old mixing container cut so that it would conform well to the leather chest plate. For the part of the collar that the ball-shaped helmet sits in, I had to sacrifice the container that holds all my plastic rings. This container is one of those ball-shaped things that you get from those vending machines that you put a quarter in, or 50 cents, or with inflation, I don't know what it is now, $20. Anyway, you turn the crank, and out comes the cheap prize, along with what else? A big sister collar. Pretty cool, huh? Once that was done, it was time for what else? Rivets from googly eyes and bullet primers, of course. To make her pauldrons or shoulder armor, I'm using some of the plastic planets that my son once had hanging from his bedroom ceiling when he was younger. And as a cool tidbit, I found that while I was working with these, the planets actually glow in the dark. Well, carry on, my wayward son. I built these by simply cutting, shaping, and overlaying the parts, then adding the bullet primers for the final details. Now that the collar and the pauldrons are built, it was time to prime and paint, following the same procedure I used earlier on the weapons. Before gluing on the helmet and pauldrons, I wrapped some leather laces around the arms. These would represent the straps that attach the pauldrons. I then glued the parts in place. Using a fine-tip marker, I added a few additional details, along with painting in some rust and damage to the pauldrons. Now it's time for the fuel tank. I built most of the fuel tank from 2 pieces cut from steel aerosol cans. I cut and I inverted the dome base of one can, and the other one I just cut down to the desired length. I sanded lightly to allow primer, paint, and glue to adhere better to the can's surface. For the rings that would be added to the fuel tank, I once again used some old mixing cups I had on hand. For the large valve wheel on the top of the tank, I wrapped a heavy armature wire around one of my wooden leather burnishers. When I was happy with the size and shape, I then soldered it closed. To build the cross arms inside the wheel, I used some small copper wires to create a framework that would hold the epoxy putty buildup, capped off with a spent bullet primer. In order to make the basket little sister rides in, it's once again zip ties to the rescue. It's funny, I keep finding more and more uses for the simple zip tie. Ooh, oh yeah, fancy. Once I got the basket formed and in place, it was time once again for black primer and paint. Not much to say here, just base painting and then adding in damage, rust, etc. Now that the base paint is done, time to do the little sister graffiti. Such a cool design element that really tells a story about the relationship of the big and little sisters. To tell you the truth, I didn't even know there was graffiti on the tank and the back of the big sisters until this build. Once the painting was completed, I added a couple of leather straps and another small side valve made from a toy car wheel and the base of a button. Once the small valve was painted, I decided to build a piece that would work for attaching the fuel tank securely to the big sister's body. Nothing really fancy here, just a couple of leather pieces primed and painted, with a few half beads and button pieces glued into place. Then with glue and screws I attached this new piece I'd created onto the tank. And with that, it was ready to attach the whole apparatus to our big sister. At this point, I'm starting to really feel good about this build. Everything's coming together. Finally, time to build the head. And for this, I've decided to go with the planet Venus.
Well, that's a huge noggin. It's a virtual planetoid. Has its own weather system. Heed! Move!
Okay, it's not that big. It's not even her head, but a helmet. Come on, give her a break. For this design element here, with the sort of vented band wrapped over the helmet, I decided once again to use leather, with the vent details tooled and beveled in. Using a rotary tool, I cut in some areas for the various portholes on her helmet. In my stash of giblets, I found an old brass door peephole and cut it down to make the telescoped porthole on the top of her helmet. For the various panels on the helmet, I once again used pieces off a toy prize vending machine ball, along with a piece cut off from another plastic planet. For the main viewing portal, I took the nut from a conduit joint and layered it with a brass washer, painted up the whole helmet using the same process as the other painted metal parts, and then used a marker for a few indications of tiny rivets. I couldn't find anything I liked to use for the portal glass reinforcement bars, so I just made them with cardstock, colored black with a marker, and cut them into thin strips and glued them into place. For the center ring, I used one of those metal spacers from a clicker type ballpoint pen. Once all of my portholes were built, I glued them in place. The smaller ones you see here, I made from tiny rivet-on eyelets, and the tiny silver one from a broken telescope. So it already had a lens in place and everything. It was great. Before I could glue the helmet in place, I had to wire in 2 red LED lights. One would be the main light for the front porthole, and the other light would be used for the rest of the smaller holes. Finally getting the helmet into place. Check that out, I'm really happy with this pile of glued together junk. Now that the figure is built, we need to do something special. How about a fireball coming out of her hand? To build my fireball, I first wired together an array of warm white LED lights. Then carefully formed and arranged cotton around the LED lights in what I felt like would make a good fireball shape. Then it was time to set up a very professional spray booth. This was done by going down to the trash and grabbing a cardboard box. Then for a professional masking job, I ripped apart a plastic shopping bag and painstakingly taped it in place. Only the highest quality of craftsmanship. I airbrushed the colors of the fireball in place by starting with lighter yellows and moving progressively to the darker oranges and finally to black on the trailing end of the fireball. For the base, I laid out a checkerboard design for the marble floor, much like the one I created for the Big Daddy build. I then used a small square file to bring out the recesses between the tiles. I wanted to give the floor some extra wear and tear by breaking up the tiles and exposing the concrete subfloor below. So I cut out the tiles using a box cutter and lifted out the pieces to glue back on as broken shards and debris. I decided I also wanted to add some old crates in as well. So after cutting some foam blocks, I overlaid them with wooden popsicle sticks. Once the foam blocks were all covered, I used a stiff wire brush to bring out the grain in the wood and add extra distress. Then I went to work optimally priming my base and crates.
Roll out!
Optimally priming. I mean, who says that? Come on. Then it was time to paint the base, carefully dry brushing layers to bring out the cracks, nicks, and pits in the foam. Most of this distressing was sort of naturally created during the building process of the Big Sister figure. Free work. The boxes were painted in a similar process as to what I did for the crates in the Handyman video. First, a rich brown base, a cooler mid-value gray, and finally a light gray dry brushing to highlight the wood grain. In the end, I added the red handprint identifier for Fontaine Smugglers. I'm sure even 8 years after Fontaine, there's a few of these still laying around. Using my soldering iron, I carved channels into the base foam. These channels created the space I needed to run wires and lights through the base. To bring in some of the design elements from Bioshock 2's Rapture, I decided to create a cluster of candles near the right foot of the Big Sister. My candles themselves were created off-camera by pouring melted wax into large boba straws and tubes of rolled-up paper. To create the flame effect on the candles, I decided to do an experiment. My plan was to drill holes into the foam base as well as the candles themselves. Then I took clusters of 3 to 4 fiber optic lines and ran them through the candles and the foam base. Then, hoping to diffuse the light coming from the ends of the fiber optic lines, I used a dab of hot glue on the end, trying to shape it like a flame. I then used a small straw to attach the fiber optics to the LED lights. I then melted wax around all my candles. The melted wax served two functions. First, it looked nice to have the puddles of wax pooling around the candle cluster, and two, it glued them in place. To the foam base, I then glued on several hardboard panels to give it a good flat foundation as well as nice smooth sides. Once those were in place, I cut some leather pieces that were soaked in water in preparation for shaping. I found in my stash a roll of decorative metal that I had bought from a dollar store several years ago. I'm sure in mind for this project, of course. I wanted this base to echo some of the design elements from the Big Daddy base and yet feel more feminine. I added zip ties for the edge trim and, of course, googly eyes for the rivets. I then cut down some more brass electrical connectors from the broken surge protector, creating some small squares that were used as inlays on the marble floor. Once everything was glued into place, it was time to paint. For additional aging and oxidation, I used a thin down oil paint wash over the base and throughout the rest of the model. This was a technique I had not used in a long time and was reminded of it when Studson Studio brought it up in one of his latest videos. Thanks, Studson. Throughout Bioshock 2 there are many hand-painted banners hung with warnings or prophecies, things of that nature. So I decided I wanted to add one of these banners in as well. I pulled a phrase from the game itself, "We will be reborn." If I remember right, I think this piece of scrap was from a dress my daughter altered. Once it was all finished, I glued it into place, and it was time for what else? Butterflies. For this, once again, my daughter to the rescue. I thought I would have to cut out a bunch of tiny butterflies out of paper or something, when my daughter asked if this would work. She had some wire with tiny metal butterflies attached. I think it's for hair decoration or something. Anyway, they were just perfect. Well, I think it's just about done. All that's left now is to put a bow on it, or a few. And remember, if you like these videos, please like, subscribe, and let me know what you think. Well, it's time for the final showcase.
Big sister is coming now. It's her. It's Big Sister.